Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's an important topic to talk about, particularly after the 4 years of the Biden administration, in which we are trying to figure out exactly what happened. There was obviously mass migration, but within that, there were certainly examples of weaponized migration. So I applaud the Center's efforts to take on this relatively unexamined subject. We should point out as well that recently a national security researcher, Joseph Humari, did some testimony before the House Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee precisely on this subject. Joseph brought out, he'd gone undercover in Central America, that the Venezuelan intelligence service was funding NGOs in Central America precisely for the purpose of helping those migrants to move to the U.S. southern border. And as we will discuss, one of the goals of weaponized migration is creating chaos and harming the interest of the target country. In my remarks, I will take a bit of a historical perspective, partly from my duties as an American diplomat abroad, and we'll focus on Cuba. Mark mentioned important work has been done here academically by the Professor Kelly Greenhill, who wrote a book about 10 years ago on this subject. Her book was called Weapons of Mass Migration, Forced Displacement, Coercion, and Foreign Policy. And one of the things that she did in this book, because it's hard to get your hands around a subject like this because it involves migration, geopolitics, et cetera, but she did put out a definition. Basically, it said that this is weaponized migration is basically coercive engineered migration designed to induce political, military, or economic concessions. And sometimes the objective of the blackmailer is to cause chaos or to gain advantage from his adversary, usually but not always as a geopolitical tool used by a weaker state to manipulate a larger, more powerful state. And Mark mentioned in his opening remarks the importance in all of this of the human rights regime that's been established for migrants since World War II. Professor Greenhill also takes her perspective since that time. And these international instruments have established something that's a ground floor of what we're dealing with today, and dealing with migrants and their perceived rights to apply for asylum or refugee status and the obligation that receiving countries have. A critical ingredient in the weaponized migration strategy for the blackmailer is that the target country considers that the human rights of the migrants paramount, and in many cases, they outweigh any other consideration in the confusion at the moment. If you look back historically, when the Western countries trumpeted the human rights of people to leave communist dictatorships, you find much of the roots of the trouble that we're dealing with. And even at that time, while the American perspective and our allies was much to use this as this right to migrate, to leave your country as a tool against the communist world, we didn't really think through the consequences of that when, in fact, the outbound migration happened. We have Victor here from Hungary, and the 1956 exodus from Hungary was a good example. The Americans encouraged that, et cetera. As it actually happened, some 200,000 Hungarians were suddenly on the doorsteps of Austria and other countries in Europe. The American plan was not exactly clear on how to deal with these people. Resources were used, the Austrians complained. It was managed, but it was certainly an example of that strategy not having been thought out. The same thing, a version of that, happened after the 1975 collapse of South Vietnam. For decades, people leaving Southeast Asia were an issue, how to deal with them, what were their rights, and so forth. Even when the West Germans finally brought about the unification of Germany, and the massive movement of East Germans into West Germany was something that they didn't want. And they, of course, used all kinds of resources to manage that situation, having announced that everyone had the right to move, but when the moment came, they had regrets. One of the best illustrations of this situation was in 1979 when President Jimmy Carter was negotiating with Deng Xiaoping over trade rights and trade obligations that the two countries would take up as China was opening. And The American president told the Chinese dictator that the United States could not trade freely with China until its record on human rights improved and Chinese were allowed to immigrate freely. Deng Xiaoping looked over and smiled at President Carter, and through the interpreter he said, "Exactly how many Chinese would you like, President Carter? 1 million, 10 million, 30 million?" The record of the back and forth indicates that President Carter dropped the subject. So this leads us to the spring of 1980, some 45 years ago, when President Carter was suddenly confronted with what Mark made a reference to is the Mariel boatlift out of Cuba. Carter's record in dealing with this situation was, from my perspective, an abject failure. Now, there will be a dispute about this because some people will say, no, we should have taken the 125,000 Cubans, we should have taken any number that came. I think that's a bad policy, and I think if you fast forward from 1980 to today, you see why that's a bad policy, and you remember the language of Deng Xiaoping. But one of the lessons is that in looking through this, you will need to find, you have the architecture of human rights, but a critical ingredient that Professor Greenhill talks about as well is political leadership in the target country. This is more important than the obligations that are perceived in terms of the international human rights, how you manage all of that. We see that today, particularly in the Western European situation, in their experience about their obligations. The European Union, all the legal architecture has suddenly taken over the ability of the political leadership to respond. So you return to Jimmy Carter in the spring of 1980. Castro had been confronted with disgruntled Cubans, and bear in mind, this is 1980. This is long before the crisis in the Soviet bloc. Castro wanted to get these people off the island. It was his old playbook, which was to drive people out, and that was mainly to the United States. So after much back and forth, a process was worked out where American private ships, small ships and boats, could go to the port town of Mariel, which is to the west of Havana, and there Cubans who had been approved for departure could board these boats and come to the United States. After the 4 years of the Biden administration, the numbers of 125,000 sound somewhat puny. But if you're old enough to remember the experience, it was somewhat sobering in the American context with these people coming without being properly vetted, cleared, and so forth. So Castro, of course, took advantage of this. He sized up his colleague, his American colleague Carter well. He not only let Cubans go who were opponents of the regime, he cleared out his prisons and mental institutions. He put spies and provocateurs into the group. The numbers are still disputed, but probably 20,000, 25,000 might have been people who we would never have accepted as people into our territory. It caused exactly what Carter wanted, long-term disruption in the United States, how to deal with these people, et cetera, and so forth. Interestingly enough, Governor Clinton in Arkansas would lose re-election, it is claimed, in 1980 because he did not manage a riot of some of these Cubans who were detained in Fort Chaffee in Arkansas. Clearly, Maduro is using this same playbook, and that is why we have hundreds, if not more, of Venezuelans in our country today who are into all kinds of criminal and terroristic enterprises, and you can read the news about how that situation is being managed. But what's clear is that Carter always put the well-being of these migrants over any other consideration in the moment of the bilateral relationship. He never really regretted his response. After his defeat in the 1980 election, which he recognized that the migrant situation out of Cuba was part of that defeat, he still maintained, Carter did, quote, "I have not been elected, I was not elected President of the United States to kill refugees." That was his premise. So you fast forward from that experience to 1994, when Castro reprises, he's now more desperate, the same scenario, releasing Cuban rafters to the United States. In the White House is President Bill Clinton. President Bill Clinton also places high priority on migrants from the Caribbean. If you follow the 1992 campaign, he spoke and criticized his predecessor George H.W. Bush, about how he's managing Haitians and other migrants. So Clinton comes into this space, not total Carter-esque, but still mindful of the rights of migrants very highly. It's part of his domestic constituency in the United States, and it is something that he cannot clearly deal with, easily deal with if he's confronted with a situation like President Carter was. So what did Clinton do? Clinton had a compromise strategy in which that the rafters were intercepted, but unlike the 1980 Mariel boat lift people, they weren't obviously clearly on American terrain when they got off the boats. Clinton, if you remember, 30-something years ago, sent these people to Guantanamo, sent the Cuban migrants to Guantanamo and to other locations. He disputed that they had implicitly a right immediately to come to the United States. Now, I would contend that at the end of the day, the Cuban dictator still got the better of the situation. I was an American diplomat in Havana in the mid-90s. We dealt with this issue constantly. We knew that Castro was dealing for his regime to survive, and the best currency he had in that process were migrants. And he knew that President Clinton, as Mark made reference to, mindful of the many hundreds, if not a few thousand Cubans who perished at sea, Clinton wanted to deal with that. And so he came up with a compromise. And I think there's a lesson there, one, for future American presidents. If you're a Democrat, don't take the people immediately to your territory. And so that's what Clinton learned. But it's an interesting thing to posit what happened between the Carter administration and the Clinton administration. There are two Republican administrations there. One was Ronald Reagan. Reagan made political hay out of the way Carter handled the 1980 Mariel boat lift. And he said there would be consequences. And Reagan's version of going to root causes of migration was expressed by his first Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, who said, if there is trouble in the Caribbean, and he meant by that migrants or other things, we will go to the source. So that's the way you deal with root causes in the Reagan administration. There were no incidences of the Castro government trying to play in the Reagan or even the Bush years the migrant card. Castro had maintained that Reagan had promised him visas, and this was also part of the settlement that Castro got from the Clinton administration, 20,000 extra visas a year for Cubans. Castro maintained that Reagan had promised him that, but those 10 years, he never did anything about that claim until he came to the Clinton administration. This comes back to my point, which is that the legal machinery about the human rights of migrants is important, and I'm hopeful that the Trump administration is going to deal with that going forward. That needs to be remade. But more important, arguably, I would say, is the political leadership. You look at Reagan to Carter, you look at Trump to Biden, and you see that if you have a strong executive leadership, the quote-unquote target country can in fact neutralize the blackmailers in those countries that want to weaponize migrants. And better off in the long term, most of these scenarios that the migrants do not move. And in some cases, that means they go through hardship. But if you're going to change, go back to Cuba, if you're going to change that regime, you have to have people in that country one day who can actually change the regime and not to live somewhere else. If you want to change Venezuela, you need those 8 million Venezuelans who have left their country to be in Venezuela to reclaim that country. So you defeat weaponized migration, I would argue, with strong political leadership. I'll stop with that.